The dining room table had 6 chairs. That Sunday, only 4 were being used. I noticed that the moment I sat down, the way I notice most things, quietly, without remarking on it. Sophie had drawn a picture of a house with a yellow sun and taped it to the wall near the window. The tape was starting to peel at one corner. I had been looking at that drawing for most of the meal, the way you look at something you already know you're going to miss. Daniel set down his fork. He said, "Dad, I need you to leave." Not "we need to talk," not "there's something we should discuss." He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed in a mirror, with enough steadiness to pass for conviction. Melissa was standing behind him near the kitchen doorway, arms folded across her chest, watching me the way she always watched me, as though she were waiting to see if I would do something she could later describe to someone else. Sophie stopped eating. She looked at me from across the table, her fork still in her hand, a piece of broccoli speared on the end of it. She was 8 years old, and she understood more than anyone in that room wanted to admit. Owen kept eating. He was 5. He didn't know what was happening. I was grateful for that, and I have thought about it many times since. I picked up my napkin and wiped my mouth. It was a white linen napkin with a small blue border. Carol had bought a set of 12 at a shop in Vermont 22 years ago, and somehow this one had survived everything. I folded it once, along the original crease, and set it beside my plate. I pushed my chair back. I stood up. Daniel said, "Dad." I said nothing. There was nothing to say that would have been useful, and I had learned a long time ago that silence in a room like that does more work than any sentence you could construct. I walked to the entryway. I put on my coat. I did not look back at the drawing on the wall, not because I had forgotten it, because I had taken a photograph of it 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon when Sophie was at school and Melissa had gone to pick up Owen, and Daniel was at work. I had walked through that house for 26 minutes. I had photographed the drawing, and the framed photograph of Carol on the hallway shelf, and 7 other things I will not list here. By that Tuesday, I already understood what Melissa was doing, and because I understood what she was doing, I understood what I was going to have to do. I closed the front door behind me. The porch light was on. The street was quiet. My car was parked at the curb where it always was, under the oak tree that my son and I had planted this spring after Carol died. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The clock on the dashboard read 6:47. My son believed her lies. He told me to leave. He told me to leave in front of my grandchildren, at a table set with napkins his mother had bought in Vermont, in a house I had helped him purchase 11 years ago. I left. I want to be precise about that. I left without a scene, without a raised voice, without a single word that could be used against me later. I left the way a man leaves when he already knows what comes next. To understand what happened that Sunday evening and what I spent the following 11 days doing, you need to know what Carol left behind, not just the trust, what she understood about people, and what she made me promise, and why she made me promise it with a notary present and a specific clause that neither Daniel nor Melissa had ever bothered to read all the way to the end. That is where this story actually begins. Carol died on a Tuesday in March, 4 years ago, in the back bedroom of the house on Fenwick Road, where we had lived for 31 years. She had been sick for 14 months, and she had used that time the way she used most of her time purposefully, without waste. She updated the trust documents twice. She wrote individual letters to Daniel and to Sophie, who was 4 then and wouldn't understand the letter for years. She organized her recipe cards into a binder with labeled tabs. And every morning until the last week, she took off her pearl ring before washing the breakfast dishes and set it on the ledge above the kitchen sink, because she said the soap would dull the luster. I still see that ring on that ledge when I stand at the sink. I have not moved the ledge. I have not repainted that wall. We had been married 38 years. She was the one who had inherited the land, 2 parcels in Harlan County from her grandmother, sold in 2009 when the mineral rights were finally settled. The proceeds became the trust $2.1 million, structured by an attorney named Nora Haynes, who had known Carol since their daughters played soccer together in 1994. The trust was Carol's creation. Her name was on the originating documents. Her intention was stated plainly in the first paragraph. This was to benefit Warren Cole and the Cole grandchildren, in that order. According to the trustee's discretion, the trustee was me. Daniel was listed as a beneficiary, not a trustee, not a co-manager, not a signatory, a beneficiary. Carol had been careful about that distinction. She had not been careful by accident. I want to be honest about Melissa in the beginning, because honesty is the only thing that makes what came later make sense. When Daniel first brought her to dinner, this was 8 years ago. Before Sophie was born, she was attentive in a way that I noticed. Not performatively attentive, not the kind of attentive that announces itself. She listened. She asked Carol about the land in Harlan County and actually waited for the full answer. She asked me about my work. I had been a private investigator for 22 years before I retired, and most people either find that either alarming or glamorous. And she found it neither. She asked what kind of cases I had found most difficult, and when I said the ones involving families, she nodded as if she had already suspected that. I thought, this is a woman who pays attention. I thought that was a virtue. I was not wrong about the paying attention. I was wrong about everything else. They married 6 years ago. The first 2 years were unremarkable. In the best sense, she came to Sunday dinners. She remembered which topics made Daniel uncomfortable and steered away from them. She sent Carol a card on her birthday and called on the anniversary of Carol's mother's death, which was a detail she had no obligation to remember. Warren noted all of this. Warren, who had spent 2 decades observing people for a living, concluded that Melissa Cole was a reasonable woman who loved his son and meant well by his family. I'm telling you this so you understand I was not a suspicious man looking for reasons to doubt her. I gave her every benefit I had. The proposals began in the 3rd year of their marriage, about 14 months after Carol died. They were reasonable proposals. That was the first thing I noticed about them, how reasonable they sounded. The trust's primary holding was in a conservative bond portfolio that Carol had specified because she distrusted volatility. Melissa pointed out, over dinner one evening, that bond yields were historically low and that a partial reallocation to index funds would likely generate significantly better returns over a 10-year horizon. She had done research. She showed me a 1-page summary she had printed from a financial planning website. She was not wrong about the yields. I told her I appreciated her thinking about it and that I would consult with Gerald. She said, of course, she just wanted to make sure we weren't leaving money on the table. I told her we were managing for stability, not growth, which was Carol's stated preference. Melissa nodded and said she understood. 3 months later, she suggested that Daniel be added as a co-signer on trust disbursements, not as a trustee. She was careful to say, just as a second signature on larger withdrawals to reduce the administrative burden on me. She framed it as consideration for my age, which I was 64 at the time and did not find particularly flattering, but I understood the intent she wanted me to perceive. I told her the trust documents specified a sole trustee and that changing that structure would require a formal amendment and a specific legal process. She said she hadn't realized it was that complicated. I said most people don't. 6 weeks after that conversation, I stopped by the house on a Wednesday afternoon to drop off a birthday card for Sophie that I had forgotten to mail. Daniel's car was not in the driveway. I let myself in through the side door the way I always had. Daniel had given me a key when they moved in, and no one had asked for it back. I could hear Melissa in the kitchen before I reached the hallway. She was on the phone. I stopped. Her voice was different. Not louder, not quieter, different in the way a person's voice is different when they believe no one is listening. She was saying, "No, he won't move on the cosigner." He cited the trust language. A pause. Then, "I know. But Gerald is the problem. He's been with the family too long. We need to think about that separately." Another pause. Longer. "The timeline depends on how cooperative Daniel stays. I'm working on it." I heard her set something down on the counter. I walked back to the side door the way I had come in. I did not leave the card. I drove home and sat at the kitchen table for a while without making coffee. Gerald's name, the word timeline, the phrase how cooperative Daniel stays. spoken in a house where Daniel's children drew pictures and taped them to walls and added "and the bread" to grace. I noted all of it. I did not call anyone that evening. I had learned a long time ago that the worst thing you can do when you have just learned something important is to act on it immediately. I waited. The third proposal came 4 months after that, at a Sunday dinner when Sophie was drawing at the kitchen table and Owen had just learned to walk and kept crossing the room toward the dog bowl. Melissa said she had been thinking, and she phrased it as thinking, not proposing that it might be worth having the trust assets reviewed for consolidation before the grandchildren were older, since estate planning was always easier to do early. She mentioned that a colleague of hers had recently gone through a similar process with her in-laws and found it very straightforward. I said I would think about it. I did think about it. I thought about it for approximately 30 seconds and concluded that the trust structure Carol had established was not going to be reviewed for consolidation at Melissa's suggestion. 2 weeks after that dinner, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening. He said he had been reading about trust administration. He used that phrase, trust administration, which was not a phrase Daniel had ever used in 34 years of being my son. He asked me 3 questions. The first was about the difference between a revocable and irrevocable trust. The second was about whether a trustee could be removed by a beneficiary and under what conditions. The third was whether Carol's original document had included any language about successor trustees. I answered all 3 questions, carefully, completely, without volunteering anything beyond what he had asked. When I finished, Daniel said, "That's helpful. Dad, thanks." There was a pause, and then he said, "Melissa was asking about some of this too. She's been trying to understand the structure." I said, "I know." He said, "Oh, then, Gerald mentioned she'd called." I said, "Gerald mentioned it, yes." The silence that followed was the silence of a man who is beginning to understand that the 2 conversations he has been having, the one with his father and the one with his wife, are not as separate as he had believed. I did not help him with that silence. I let it do its work. He said goodnight. I said goodnight. I set the phone down and looked at the ring ledge above the sink for a long time. What I want to be clear about is this: at that point, I still was not certain. Melissa's proposals were the kind of proposals that reasonable people make. A financial advisor could have made every one of them without raising any concern. The fact that she kept returning to the subject of the trust was notable. I noted it, but I had spent enough years watching people to know that notation is not the same as conclusion. I watched. I waited. I said very little. The call from Gerald Marsh came on a Wednesday morning in October. Gerald had managed the trust's assets for 19 years, since before Carol's land sale was finalized, and he had a voice that I associated with careful men, measured, precise, with long pauses before anything important. He said that a woman had called his office the previous Friday, identifying herself as Daniel Cole's wife, and that she had requested what she called basic structural information about the trust, including the distribution schedule and the amendment process, explaining that she was preparing documentation for their joint tax filing. Gerald said he had not provided any information. He said he was calling me because he wanted to make sure I knew. He paused in the way he always paused before anything important, and then he said, "Warren, this is the second time." I asked him when the first time was. He said 3 months ago. A different question, something about beneficiary designations. He said he hadn't called then because he'd assumed it was routine. He was calling now because it wasn't. I thanked him. I told him to document both contacts in writing and send me copies. He said he already had. Then I sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. The ring ledge above the sink was in my peripheral vision. I did not look at it directly. I called Nora Haynes that afternoon. Nora had drafted the original trust with Carol in 2009 and had amended it twice in Carol's final year. She knew the document the way a surgeon knows an anatomy, not just the structure, but the reasoning behind every decision. I asked her one question: if I wanted to modify the distribution structure, how long would it take? She said 2 weeks if I had the supporting documentation in order. I said I had it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Do you want to tell me what's happening?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "All right, come in Thursday." I said I would. I did not call Daniel. I did not confront Melissa. I had spent 22 years working cases where the single worst thing an investigator could do was let the subject know they were being watched. People who believe they are unobserved continue to behave as themselves. I needed Melissa to continue behaving as herself. I went to see Nora on Thursday. I brought every document Carol had ever signed in connection with that trust, organized in the order Nora had originally drafted them, in a folder that Carol had labeled in her own handwriting and that I had not opened in 14 months. I opened it on Nora's desk. We worked for 3 hours. When I drove home, I stopped at the Fenwick Road house and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes without turning on the lights. The pearl ring ledge was there in the dark. Carol had known, when she wrote that trust, that the people who loved her most might not always agree about what love required. She had written the document to survive that disagreement. I had not understood, when she made me promise to read every clause, that she was preparing me for a specific conversation I had not yet had. I understood it now. 3 weeks before the Sunday dinner, I got a phone call from Ruth Calloway. Ruth lives 4 houses down from me on Fenwick Road. She is 71 years old, and she spent 32 years as a clerk in the county courthouse before she retired. And she has the particular quality of attention that comes from decades of watching people try to conceal things in official paperwork. She notices what doesn't fit. She called me on a Thursday afternoon. At 4:17, I noted the time because I was in the middle of reviewing a clause in Carol's original trust document, and I'd marked my place with my thumb. She said she'd seen a man outside my house that morning. Not a neighbor, not a delivery driver. He had parked a gray sedan on the street and walked the perimeter of my property twice, photographing the exterior and the side gate. When she'd come out to check her mail, he'd asked her, in a conversational way, whether the older gentleman who lived there was home often, whether he had family nearby, whether he lived alone. Ruth had told him she didn't know the neighbors well and gone back inside. Then she'd written down his license plate number on the back of an envelope. She read it to me. I wrote it down on the margin of the document I'd been reading. "Thank you, Ruth," I said. "Warren," she said, "I worked in that courthouse for 32 years. I know what a process server looks like, and I know what a private investigator looks like. That man was not a process server." I told her I appreciated the call. I told her to keep the envelope. After we hung up, I sat with the plate number for a few minutes. Then I called a contact I'd kept from my own years in the field, a man named Doucette, who runs a small agency out of a strip mall on Route 9 and who owes me a professional courtesy from an incident in 2009 that I have no reason to describe here. It took Doucette 40 minutes to call back. The gray sedan was registered to a firm called Meridian Investigative Services. Meridian's primary client base, according to their own website, was estate attorneys and family law practices. I set the phone down. I looked at the plate number I'd written in the margin of Carol's trust document, directly beside a clause she had included about the conditions under which a trustee could be removed. She had written that clause herself. She had asked me to read it 3 times before she signed. I read it again now. 2 weeks before the Sunday dinner, Daniel called and asked if I'd come over to talk. He said he wanted to discuss the trust, the long-term structure of it, what made sense for the family going forward. He said it carefully, the way a person says something they've rehearsed. I told him I'd come Thursday evening. When I arrived, Melissa was not in the room. She was somewhere in the back of the house. I heard a door close when I came in, and once during the conversation, I heard the faint sound of movement behind the wall to my left. Daniel had set 2 glasses of water on the coffee table. He had a piece of paper in his hand, folded once along the center. I looked at the piece of paper in his hands, and I thought about a Sunday in April, 3 weeks after Carol's funeral, when Daniel had come over without calling ahead. He had let himself in and found me at the kitchen table with the trust documents spread out in front of me, all of them, the originals, the amendments, the notarized copies. He had sat down across from me without saying anything for a while. Then he had picked up the page with Carol's handwriting on it, the paragraph she had written herself. in the margin of the original draft about her intentions for the grandchildren, and he had read it slowly, the way you read something you want to make sure you have right. He had set it down and said, "She thought about everything, didn't she?" I had said yes. He had said, "I want you to know I'm not going to be the kind of son who makes this harder than it has to be. Whatever she set up, I trust it. I trust you." I had believed him. I want to be clear about that. In that kitchen, on that Sunday in April, with Carol 3 weeks gone and the documents between us and the ring ledge empty above the sink, I had believed my son completely. He unfolded it and began to read. The list had 7 points. The language was careful and specific in a way that Daniel's language, in 34 years of knowing him, had never been. Point 3 referred to diminished capacity for complex fiduciary decision-making, a phrase Daniel would not have assembled on his own. Point 5 cited my age and the increasing administrative burden placed on a sole trustee without institutional support. Point 6 suggested that a co-trustee arrangement with Daniel in a primary administrative role would better serve the trust's beneficiaries. He read all 7 points without looking up. When he finished, I waited a moment. Then I said, "Did you write that list yourself?" He looked at the paper. He looked at the glass of water on the table. He looked at a point somewhere between the two. 4 seconds passed. I counted them the same way I used to count seconds in a surveillance vehicle, not impatiently, but as a professional habit. 4 seconds of silence from a grown man who has been asked a simple question is not a pause. It is an answer. "Dad," he said, "I just think it's worth talking about." I told him I agreed. I told him I would think about everything he'd said. I drove home on the same roads I'd been driving for 30 years. And when I got inside, I did not turn on the television or make coffee or do any of the things I usually do when I need to settle my thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the pearl ring ledge in the dark for a while. Then I called Nora Haynes and told her to move the timeline up. The following Monday, I drove to the office of Cartwright and Associates on Millbrook Avenue, where Carol's original trust documents had been notarized and where the certified copies were kept on file. I had called ahead. The woman at the front desk walked me back to a private room and said Patricia would be with me shortly. Patricia Osei has been a notary for 31 years. She had been in that office when Carol signed the original trust document. She had witnessed Carol's signature, had pressed her seal into the page, had looked at Carol directly, and asked whether she was signing of her own free will and full understanding. Carol had said yes. Patricia had said, "I know you are. Mrs. Cole, I just have to ask." They had both smiled at that. Carol had told me about it afterward. Patricia came into the room carrying a file. She set it on the table and then looked at me over the top of it, a brief, deliberate look, the kind that precedes something being said that has been decided in advance. "Mr. Cole," she said, "before we go through the documents, there's something I want you to know." I waited. "About 2 weeks ago, a woman came in requesting access to the certified copy of your trust document. She said she was the wife of your son." Patricia set her hands flat on the file. "She said she needed to review the trustee succession clauses for what she described as estate planning purposes." The room was very quiet. The building's ventilation system made a low, even sound. "I did not provide the copy," Patricia said. "The document is accessible only to the trustee of record or to a party with written authorization from the trustee of record. She had neither—" She paused. She was not pleased when I explained that. I said, "What did she say?" "She said she would find another way to get what she needed." Patricia looked at me steadily. "I thought you should know that. Mr. Cole." I thanked her. I meant it plainly, without elaboration, because Patricia Osei is a woman who has spent 31 years watching people perform gratitude in legal settings, and she would recognize the performance immediately. She nodded once and opened the file. We went through the documents for 40 minutes. I asked the questions I had come to ask. I took notes in the small notebook I carry in my jacket pocket, the same kind of notebook I used for 22 years in the field. narrow-ruled, with a red cardboard cover. When we finished, Patricia walked me to the front and said, "Take care of yourself, Mr. Cole." I drove home. I did not stop anywhere. That evening, I called Nora and told her what Patricia had said. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So she went to the source directly. That tells us something about the timeline she's working with." I said I agreed. Nora said, "Are you ready to sign?" I told her I was. The document we had been preparing was not a revocation. I want to be precise about that. I did not remove Daniel from the trust. His name remained exactly where Carol had put it, in the clause she had written herself, in the handwriting I had known for 40 years. What I changed was the architecture beneath it, the mechanism that determined how and when and in what form the trust's assets could move. The modification established an irrevocable charitable remainder trust. The principal, the full value of the assets Carol had spent 20 years accumulating and protecting, transferred into that structure, where it would generate income for a single beneficiary during that beneficiary's lifetime. That beneficiary was me. After my death, the remainder would pass to a scholarship fund established in Carol's name to support first-generation college students in the county where she had grown up. Daniel remained a named beneficiary. The trust documents still carried his name, but the principal was no longer accessible to him, or to anyone acting on his behalf, or to any co-trustee arrangement that might be proposed by a wife who had spent the last several months consulting estate attorneys and hiring investigators to photograph my house and sending a woman to a notary's office to request documents she had no right to request. Nora filed the modification on Thursday morning. Patricia O.C., who had agreed to serve as witness, pressed her seal into the final page at 10:14 a.m. I signed the last document with the same pen I had used to sign Carol's original trust 16 years earlier. I had kept the pen in the same drawer since then. Nora had asked me once why I still had it. I had told her I wasn't sure. I understood now that Carol had known I would need it again. The Sunday dinner was 3 days away. I had not told Daniel. I had not told Melissa. I had not told Ruth Calloway, who had given me the plate number that started the final sequence, or Gerald Marsh, who had called me twice in the past month with questions I had answered carefully and incompletely. I had told no one except Nora, and Nora kept the kind of silence that 30 years of trust law teaches a person to keep. I drove home from her office on Thursday afternoon and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it cooled. The yard was the same yard it had always been. The oak tree Carol had planted the spring after Daniel was born had grown taller than the roofline now. She had said, when she put it in the ground, that she wanted something in the yard that would still be growing after she was gone. It was still growing. I drank the coffee and went to bed at my usual time. The Sunday dinner was in 3 days, and there were things I still needed to do before then, and I had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a man can do the night before a difficult situation is stay awake thinking about it. I slept without difficulty. The Sunday dinner was at 6. I arrived at 5:55, the same way I always had a bottle of Carol's favorite Bordeaux under my arm, the kind she used to say was too expensive for a weeknight, but always finished anyway. Daniel answered the door. He looked like he hadn't slept well. He stepped back to let me in without saying anything, and I walked past him into the front hallway, where the smell of roast chicken and something herbed filled the air. And Sophie came running from the kitchen with flour on her hands and said, "Grandpa, I helped make the bread." I told her the bread would be the best part. She beamed and ran back. Owen was in the living room with a book open on the floor in front of him, not reading it, just looking at the pictures. He waved at me without looking up. I waved back. The table was set for 5. That detail registered, and I filed it away. Melissa came out of the kitchen carrying a serving dish, and she smiled at me, the way she always smiled, warm, practiced. The smile of a woman who had decided long ago what impression she wanted to make, and had been making it ever since. She said, "Warren, so glad you could make it." As if I had been invited rather than simply expected. As if the phrasing mattered. It did. but not in the way she intended. We sat down. Sophie said grace the way Daniel had taught her, the short version, and Owen added, "and the bread," at the end because Sophie had told him about the bread, and everyone laughed, and for 11 minutes it was a Sunday dinner like any other Sunday dinner. Then Melissa put a folder on the table. It was not a thin folder. It was the kind of folder that has been assembled with care-tabbed, labeled, the pages inside aligned with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this moment more than once. She set it in front of Daniel rather than opening it herself. That was the first thing I noticed. She was letting him hold it. She had done her work, and now she was stepping back, letting Daniel be the one to carry it forward, which meant that if it went wrong, he would be the one standing in the open. I had seen that move before. I had seen it in interview rooms, in deposition halls, and in the offices of people who believed that distance from a bad act was the same as innocence. Daniel opened the folder. He looked at the first page, then he looked at me, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been told something upsetting and has decided that the most responsible thing to do is to take it seriously. He said, "Dad, Melissa and I have been doing some research about the trust, about some concerns that have come up." I said, "What concerns?" He turned the folder and slid it across the table toward me. The first page was a printed email, my name in the sender field, a date from 8 months ago, a message declining to authorize a routine medical disbursement for a procedure Carol's trust had specifically designated as covered. The email was not one I had written. The formatting was close, but the address in the header was a single character off. The kind of thing you would miss if you were reading quickly. The kind of thing I had been trained 30 years ago to look for. Below it was a printed screenshot of a text message, cropped so that the beginning and end were missing, showing only a middle section that, without context, could be read as confirmation of negligence. Below that was a 2-page statement from someone identified as a financial management consultant, asserting that the trust had been administered with insufficient documentation and declining performance benchmarks. Daniel said, "We had these reviewed by someone independent." Sophie had stopped eating. She was looking at me with the specific stillness of a child who has understood that something is wrong but does not yet know what kind of wrong it is. Owen set down his fork and looked at his sister, then at me. He said, "Grandpa, are you in trouble?" I said, "No, buddy, not even a little." I looked at Daniel. I said, "Did you read the full trust document, the original, not whatever version Melissa printed out?" Daniel said, "I read it. We both read it." I said, "No, you didn't." The table was quiet. Melissa picked up her wine glass and held it without drinking. She was watching Daniel, not me, Daniel. I noted that. Daniel said, "Dad." He stopped. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. His jaw was tight in the way it had been when he was 17 and had been caught in something he didn't know how to get out of gracefully. He said, "Dad, I need you to leave." Melissa said nothing. She did not need to. I looked at Sophie. She was 8 years old, and she was looking at me with Carol's eyes the same shape, the same particular quality of attention, the kind that sees more than it lets on. I thought about the oak tree in the yard. I thought about Carol saying she wanted something that would still be growing after she was gone. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I took my jacket from the hook by the door. I walked back to the table and I crouched down next to Owen and shook his hand the way I had taught him to shake hands, firmly, looking at the other person. He shook back. I straightened up and kissed Sophie on the top of her head. She didn't say anything, but she leaned into it for just a moment, the way children do when they are trying to hold on to something without admitting they are trying to hold on to it. I looked at Daniel. I nodded once. He didn't look away. I'll give him that. He held my eyes the whole time, and I could see that part of him knew not what he was wrong about, not yet, but that he was wrong about something. That knowledge was in there somewhere. Melissa had buried it under a folder full of carefully assembled paper, but it was still in there. I walked out. The drive home was 23 miles on a road I had driven more times than I could count, through 3 townships and past the reservoir where Daniel and I used to fish on Saturday mornings when he was young enough to think catching nothing was still a good use of a Saturday. I drove the speed limit. I did not turn on the radio. There was nothing I needed to think through that I had not already thought through, and the silence was not uncomfortable. I had made my peace with silence a long time ago. Carol used to say I was the only person she knew who could sit quietly in a car for an hour and come out of it rested rather than restless. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I got home at 8:47. I set my jacket on the chair by the door and went to the kitchen and made tea and sat at the table with it until it was gone. At 7:19 the next morning, my phone rang. The number was Gerald Marsh's direct line. Gerald had been the trust's financial advisor for 19 years, since before Carol's diagnosis, since back when the trust was still a plan rather than a necessity. He was a methodical man with a quiet voice and the particular carefulness of someone who understood that his job was to protect things that could not protect themselves. He said, "Warren, I need to ask you something directly." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "Melissa Cole called me last night, around 9:30. She asked me to prepare a valuation report on the trust assets, a formal one, formatted for court submission. She said you had agreed to step down as trustee and that the report would be needed to support a petition for successor appointment." He paused. Gerald was not a man who paused without reason. He said, "Did you agree to step down?" I said, "No." He said, "I didn't think so. I want you to know that I recorded the call. I record all calls that come in after business hours. It's been my practice for 11 years. I have the full conversation." She was specific about what she wanted the report to include and specific about the timeline. She mentioned the court date 3 times. He paused again. "Would you like a copy of the recording?" I said, "Yes, send it to Nora Haynes. She's expecting materials." Gerald said, "Already drafted the cover note. I'll send it within the hour." Then he said, "Warren, I've worked with this family for 19 years. I want you to know that I have never had any concern about how this trust has been managed. Not once." I said, "I know, Gerald, thank you." I hung up and sat with the phone on the table in front of me for a moment. Then I called Nora. She picked up on the second ring. Nora Haynes had been a trust and estates attorney for 26 years, and she had the voice of someone who had heard every version of every financial dispute and was not alarmed by any of them. I told her about the dinner. I told her about the folder, the email that wasn't mine, the cropped screenshot, the consultant's statement. I told her about Gerald's call. She said, "The recording is useful, very useful." Then she said, "Warren, you should know the amended trust document we filed last Thursday with the county recorder's office went through without issue. It's on record. The charitable remainder provisions are locked. The successor trustee designation is locked. Everything we filed is public record as of Thursday afternoon at 4:17. I said, "So there's nothing for Melissa to petition the court to change?" Nora said, "There's nothing she can change. No, she can still file. But the moment Judge Whitfield opens that case file, she's going to see what's already on record, and then she's going to have some questions for the petitioner." She paused. "Do you want me to file a motion to expedite the hearing?" I said, "No. Let Melissa file. Let her choose the date. Let her bring whoever she wants to bring." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree at the edge of the yard, just visible from this angle, the upper branches catching the early light. I want everyone in that courtroom. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, I'll be ready." I said, "I know you will." I hung up and finished my tea. It had gone cold while I was on the phone. I drank it anyway. The courtroom was on the 4th floor of the Harmon County Civil Court building, a room I had been in twice before, once in 1998 for a contract dispute involving a property easement, and once in 2011 when Carol's estate was formally settled. The room smelled the same both times: old wood, recycled air, and something faintly chemical that I had never been able to identify. It smelled the same on that Wednesday morning in April. I arrived 20 minutes early. Nora was already there, seated at the respondent's table, her briefcase open, a single legal pad in front of her, covered in her small, precise handwriting. She had a tab-marked folder set to one side, not thick, not imposing, but organized with the kind of deliberate calm that comes from knowing exactly what you have. She looked up when I walked in and gave me a small nod. I sat beside her and put nothing on the table. I had nothing to put. Melissa's legal team arrived 8 minutes later. There were 3 of them, the lead attorney, a man named Kavanaugh, who had a reputation in Harmon County for aggressive civil filings, and 2 associates carrying what appeared to be 2 full accordion files of supporting documents. They set everything on the petitioner's table with the practiced confidence of people who had done this many times and expected to do it again, soon. Kavanaugh arranged his folders in a specific order, straightened them, then straightened them again. I had seen that gesture before, in other rooms, from other people who confused preparation with certainty. Daniel and Melissa came in together. Melissa wore a charcoal blazer and kept her expression composed, the composed look of someone who had rehearsed it. Daniel walked slightly behind her, one hand touching the small of her back, in a way that looked more like steadying himself than guiding her. He sat down beside her without looking around the room. He did not look at me. He had not looked at me since the Sunday evening 3 weeks ago, when he had stood in his own front doorway, in front of Sophie and Owen, and told me there was no room for me at the table. Gerald Marsh was seated in the second row of the gallery, on the respondent's side. He had driven 40 minutes to be there. I had called him the previous Friday, and he had said, without hesitation, "I'll be there, Warren." He was wearing the same blue tie he wore to Carol's funeral. I noticed that. He was watching the room the way people watch rooms when they know what is about to happen in them. Patricia Osei sat at the far end of the same row, her hands folded in her lap, her posture perfectly straight. She had agreed to appear as a witness regarding Melissa's visit to her office, the questions Melissa had asked about amending trust documents, the questions that Patricia had answered carefully and recorded in her office log the same afternoon. Patricia had been a notary for 31 years. She did not look toward the petitioner's table. She looked at the front of the room and waited. Ruth Calloway was there too, seated in the third row. She had asked to come. I had told her she didn't need to, and she had said, "Warren, I've been a courthouse secretary for 26 years. I know what a courtroom looks like when something important is about to happen. I'd like to see this one." She was wearing her good coat. Judge Constance Whitfield entered at 9:02. The room stood. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with close-cropped silver hair and the particular stillness of someone who had spent 19 years listening to people tell her things that were not entirely true and had learned to wait for the part that was. She settled into her chair, put on her reading glasses, and opened the case file in front of her. She did not look up immediately. She read. Kavanaugh stood and began his presentation at 9:07. He was thorough. I will give him that. He had organized his argument in layers: the claim that I was no longer capable of serving as trustee, supported by a psychological evaluation from a doctor I had never met, a series of emails presented as evidence of erratic communication, and a recording, approximately 4 minutes long, of a phone conversation between myself and Daniel from 6 weeks prior. The recording had been edited. I had heard the original. Nora had a copy of the original as well, obtained through a process I had trusted her to manage without asking for details. Kavanaugh spoke for 19 minutes. He was confident. He had reason to be from where he was standing. The case looked airtight. A sitting trustee of a family trust, allegedly diminished, with documentation supporting removal and replacement. The replacement trustee Melissa had proposed was a financial management firm she had begun consulting with 2 months earlier. I had found that out from Gerald, who had recognized the firm's name when Melissa mentioned it during her second visit to his office, the visit she had made 3 days after I left the Sunday dinner table and did not come back. When Kavanaugh finished, Judge Whitfield did not respond to him immediately. She took off her reading glasses, set them on the bench, and reached for the second folder, Nora's folder, the thinner one with the color-coded tabs. She put her glasses back on and opened it. She read for approximately 2 minutes. Then she turned back to the first tab and read again. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when the people in them are not sure what is happening but can sense that something has shifted. Judge Whitfield set the folder down. She looked at Kavanaugh over the rim of her glasses. "Counsel," she said, "when did your client become aware of the trust amendment filed on March 14th? Kavanaugh's expression did not change immediately. He glanced down at his papers, then back up. "Your Honor, I'm not certain which amendment you're referring to. The trust documentation we reviewed, the amendment filed on March 14th of this year," Judge Whitfield said, with the patience of someone who had already asked the question once and was not going to ask it a third time. "Executed before a licensed notary, witnessed by 2 parties, and recorded with the county clerk's office on the same date. It appears in the court record it was filed 9 days before this petition was submitted." The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. I counted them. Kavanaugh turned to his associates. One of them was already pulling papers from the accordion file. The other had opened a laptop. Melissa leaned forward slightly. I watched her face from across the room. It did not change all at once. It changed the way ice changes when the temperature shifts: first, a stillness, then a line, then another, and then the surface is no longer what it was. She had known about the amendment. I could see the exact moment she understood that the judge also knew, and that Kavanaugh did not, and that the distance between those 2 facts was the entire case. Kavanaugh leaned toward Melissa and said something in a low voice. I watched her face as he spoke. Whatever he said, it was not what she wanted to hear. She turned to look at Daniel. Daniel was staring at the bench. Then Kavanaugh said something else. I could not hear the words, but I could see his expression shift from confidence to something more careful, and Melissa's composure moved in a way I had not seen before. Not collapse, a fracture. The specific fracture of a person who has built something very precisely and is watching it fail at a joint she had considered secure. Daniel turned to her. He said it quietly, but the room was quiet enough that I heard it, and Gerald heard it, and Patricia, seated at the end of the row, heard it. He said, "You told me this was already handled." Melissa did not answer. She looked at the bench. Kavanaugh put his hand on the table between them as if to redirect, but Daniel did not look at Kavanaugh. He looked at Melissa for a moment longer, and then he looked down at his own hands, and I could see in his face the specific expression of a man who has just understood something he had been not understanding for a very long time. Judge Whitfield did not wait for Kavanaugh to finish consulting his associates. She removed her glasses and addressed the room. The Cole Family Trust was amended on March 14th by the grantor and sole trustee, Warren Cole, acting within his full legal authority under the terms of the original trust instrument. The amendment is irrevocable. It restructures the principal into a charitable remainder trust with designated beneficiaries and removes the discretionary distribution provisions that this petition is predicated on. She paused. There is no trustee to replace in the manner this petition describes. The discretionary principle this petition seeks to bring under new management no longer exists in that form. What remains is a fixed-term instrument with a named remainder beneficiary and a defined distribution schedule. She set the folder down on the bench and looked directly at Melissa. "Mrs. Cole, I would strongly suggest you speak with your attorney about the implications of what I've just described." Melissa said nothing. She was looking at the bench, or through it. I was not certain which. Kavanaugh requested a continuance. He used the word procedural twice in the same sentence. Judge Whitfield looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard every version of every request and has stopped being surprised by any of them. "Denied," she said. "The amendment is a matter of public record and was available to any party conducting due diligence prior to filing. This court does not grant continuances to address documentation that was accessible before the petition was submitted." She made a note on her legal pad. "We will proceed to the question of costs." Gerald Marsh, in the second row, exhaled slowly. He had been holding that breath since Kavanaugh began. I heard it from where I was sitting. He looked at me. I looked back at him. He gave a single, small nod, the nod of a man who has watched a family's finances for 19 years and has just seen them protected in a way he could not have arranged himself. I nodded back. Patricia Osei remained perfectly still. She had not been called to testify. The amendment's validity had rendered that unnecessary, but she was there, and her presence was its own kind of record. She had sat in that room for 2 hours and had not once looked at the petitioner's table. That was enough. Daniel stood up. He did it suddenly, the way people stand when they are not sure they are going to, and then they do. His chair scraped back against the floor. Melissa reached for his arm. He moved slightly away from her hand, not much. Not enough for most people to notice. I noticed. I had spent 30 years noticing things that other people moved past. He looked across the room at me. It was the first time since the Sunday dinner, since Sophie had asked why Grandpa was leaving and Owen had started crying on the front step. Daniel looked at me, the way a man looks at someone when he has run out of things to say and is not sure if there is anything left that would be worth saying. I did not speak. I had nothing to add to what was already in the record. Everything I needed to say to that room, to that case, to that family, I had said on the 14th of March, 9 days before Melissa filed her petition, when I was still the man she invited to Sunday dinners and had not yet become the man she believed she could remove. Nora gathered her folder. She did it quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. She capped her pen and slid the legal pad into her briefcase and clicked it shut. She leaned over and said, very quietly, "That's it." She did not say it with satisfaction. Exactly. She said it the way people say things that are simply true. I said, yes. Judge Whitfield adjourned the proceeding at 10:19. The gallery began to move. Ruth Calloway stood and buttoned her coat. Gerald Marsh waited. Patricia Osei rose, gathered her bag, and walked toward the door without looking back. Kavanaugh was speaking to Melissa in a low, urgent voice. I did not hear what he was saying. I did not need to. The accordion files were still on the table, 2 of them, full of documentation assembled to establish that I was not capable of managing what Carol had left behind. The irrevocable amendment was 11 pages. Nora had filed it on a Tuesday afternoon. Patricia had notarized it. The county clerk had recorded it before close of business the same day. Daniel was still standing. Melissa had her hand on his arm now, and he had not moved away from it. He was looking at the floor. I watched him for a moment, and I thought about the year after Carol died, when Daniel was 26 and called me every Sunday evening without being asked, and we talked about nothing important for 20 or 30 minutes, and then said goodnight. And it was enough. I thought about that. Then I stood up, straightened my jacket, and picked up my copy of the amended trust document from the table. The clerk, a young woman named Ades, who had been stationed at the side table throughout the entire proceeding and had not once changed her expression, looked up as I passed. She said, "Have a good morning, sir." I told her I intended to. Nora called me on a Thursday afternoon, 8 days after the hearing. She said Melissa's attorney had sent a letter 2 pages, single-spaced, proposing a negotiated settlement regarding the trust assets. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I asked Nora what she intended to say. She was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her clicking a pen on the other end of the line. Then she said, "I'm going to tell them there's nothing to negotiate because there's nothing in scope." I asked her to say that in exactly those words. She said she already had. The response went out the following morning. One sentence. Nora told me later that Melissa's attorney called back within the hour and asked if there was any flexibility. Nora told him the irrevocable structure of the charitable remainder trust predated the dispute by 9 days, that the $2.1 million in principal had been permanently removed from any estate subject to claim, and that no court in this jurisdiction would revisit a completed transfer made in good faith before any petition was filed. The attorney asked if Warren Cole would consider a conversation. Nora said Warren Cole had already said everything he needed to say. She told me she hung up before he could respond. I told her that was fine. 10 days after Nora's response went out, she called me again. She said Kavanaugh had filed a motion to withdraw from the case. The motion cited a conflict of interest specifically, that documents in his own case file did not match the originals on record with the county clerk's office. 2 emails presented as evidence of my erratic communication had metadata that predated the email accounts they were supposedly sent from. Kavanaugh's motion did not say who had provided those documents. It did not need to. Nora said, "He's protecting himself, which means he's no longer protecting her." I asked about Gerald's recording the call Melissa had made to his office the night after the Sunday dinner, the one where she had asked him to prepare a valuation report for court submission and mentioned the court date 3 times. Nora said Gerald had forwarded the recording, along with a written summary of both contacts Melissa had made to his office, to the State Bar's Trust Oversight Division. She said the division had acknowledged receipt and opened a preliminary review. She said she did not know what would come of it. She said she thought I should know it was in motion. I said, "Thank you, Nora." She said, "Warren, this part isn't finished. I want you to understand that, whatever happens with the review, it will take time, and it may not resolve the way you'd want it to, but she is not walking away from this cleanly." I told her I understood. I did not need it to be clean. I needed it to be real. Those are different things. The letter from Melissa's side did not come again. There was nothing left to write. 3 weeks after the hearing, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. I was in the living room, reading. I looked at the screen. It was Daniel. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, I picked up. He said, "Dad." He stopped. Then he said, "I didn't know she had done those things. I want you to know that. I didn't know about the approach to Gerald, or the documents she tried to have reclassified. I didn't know any of it. I didn't say anything. I've learned, over 40 years of asking questions for a living, that silence makes people say things they wouldn't otherwise say." Daniel said 2 more sentences. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know how to fix it. Then I said, "You know, Daniel, that may not matter as much as you think it does." He was quiet. I wasn't saying it to wound him. I was saying it because it was true, and because he was old enough to hear true things without being protected from them. Knowing and not knowing are different weights, but they both sit on the same scale. A man who doesn't see what's happening in his own house has still allowed it to happen. I understood that. I had been a father long enough to understand that love and accountability are not opposites. I said, "We'll talk when you're ready." Then I told him good night, and I set the phone on the arm of the chair, and I went back to my book. I did not sleep well that night, but I had not slept well for a long time, and that was not new. 2 months after the hearing, on a Saturday in the late October, my phone rang again. I was in the garage, going through a box of Carol's things I had been meaning to sort for 3 years and had not. The call was from Daniel's number. I picked up, and the voice on the other end was not Daniel's. Sophie said, "Grandpa, can you come to my recital?" She said it the way 8-year-olds say things they have rehearsed carefully, with the particular seriousness of a child who has decided this matters. I asked her when. She told me Saturday at 2 o'clock at the community center on Birchwood. I wrote it on the back of an envelope that was sitting on the workbench. I told her I would be there. She said, "Okay." Then she said, "Owen wants to say hi." There was a rustling sound, and then Owen said something that may have been, "Hi, Grandpa," or may have been something else entirely, because Owen was 5 and had strong opinions about consonants. I told him hi back. Then Sophie came back on and said goodbye in the same careful voice, and the call ended. I set the phone down on the workbench, next to the envelope with the address written on it. I stood there for a moment, looking at Carol's box. There was a photograph on top one I hadn't seen in years, from a 4th of July, maybe 15 years ago. Carol and Daniel and a younger version of me standing in front of the house on Millbrook before we sold it. Daniel was laughing at something outside the frame. Carol had her hand on my arm. I put the photograph in my shirt pocket and closed the box. On Saturday, I drove 23 miles to the Birchwood Community Center. I arrived 11 minutes early and sat in the 3rd row, on the aisle side. The room filled up around me, parents with younger children, a few grandparents, a man with a video camera on a tripod near the back. I looked for Melissa. She was not there. Sophie played a piece I didn't recognize, something with a lot of left-hand work, and she played it with the focused frown of someone who had practiced it until the frown was part of the music. She did not make a mistake, or, if she did, I couldn't hear it. When she finished, she looked up at the audience, and she found me in the third row, and she gave a very small nod, not a wave, a nod, the kind that means I see you, and then she looked back at her music for the next piece. Owen was sitting 2 rows in front of me with Daniel. He turned around 3 times during the performance to look at things that were not the stage. The third time, he saw me and raised one hand in a solemn wave. I raised mine back. After the recital, Daniel walked over with Owen on his hip. He looked like he hadn't slept well either. He said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." I said, "Of course." Owen reached out and grabbed my collar with one hand, the way small children grab things they want to examine more closely. I let him. Sophie came out from behind the stage door, still holding her music, and walked straight to me without stopping, and I put my arm around her, and she leaned against my side for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Did you hear the hard part in the middle?" I told her I heard it. She nodded like that settled something. I drove home on the same route I'd been taking for 22 years. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going inside. The porch light was on. I leave it on now. A habit I picked up after Carol died, because coming home to a dark house is a particular kind of quiet I don't need more of. I went inside, set my keys on the kitchen windowsill. That was Carol's spot, not for keys, but for her pearl ring, the one she took off every morning before washing dishes, and set right there on the sill, in the corner where the wood is slightly worn from 31 years of the same gesture. I don't move things from that spot. I'm not sure when that became a rule, but it is one. I filled the kettle and put it on the burner. I didn't turn the kitchen light on right away. I stood in the dark for a moment, looking out through the window at the backyard, the oak tree, the fence line, the neighbor's light on the other side. It was quiet, not the quiet of a house where something has been lost, but a different kind, the kind that has room in it. Then I turned the light on and waited for the water to boil.